Peter and Alkistis, welcome back. Thank you very much for your time. How are you guys?
Really good, thank you.
Yeah, really good, Gordon.
It's nice to be back.
Yeah, it is. And I'm glad it's you guys that are doing this. So obviously we're here to look at Jake Stratton-Kent's legacy. And I think that's the right way of saying it, because when he did pass, I mean, we put out some stuff, reminiscences on, I would say, a more personal basis, and a few others did as well. And that was right. That's the right thing to do immediately after someone passes. But since that moment, I have been thinking about his legacy and how and where Jake's thought has influenced my own. So I wanted to do a show looking at his work, and you guys having published, I guess, the most amount of Jake words, if not, because if I think about where else he published, there are, pamphlets and smaller books, but in terms of word count, most of his published words are certainly are certainly you guys. So I guess I want to start with Jake as a person, because we've been kind of going back and forth to talk about topic areas, and I mean, what's your this far out initial or preeminent thoughts about Jake as a person, who was someone you knew and worked with for years?
Do you want to start?
No, you.
Okay.
Well,
first of all, I think it's been difficult for a lot of people in the community, because we all hoped that Jake would have another decade of productive magical work ahead of him, at least. Certainly, he was slowing down with his emphysema, and he was finding some things more difficult. But the stroke was really quite a shock for everyone. Even though Jake had, famously lived hard. I mean, he'd made the decisions which shortened his life, and it's a pity that happened. But at the same time, there's a real sense of gratitude that he was able to complete the majority of his life's work. And very few people can die and feel that they've actually left a mark on the world.
I feel very thankful that I knew him. It's especially, it's very stark feeling now that he's not here and I won't see him again, but you realize just how much he gave and how much he well, I mean, because I was working on his books and I was working directly with his text and his voice like that, with the editing and the formatting, he was so close in so many ways. Like his phrasing, his words, his ideas were like round and round, and I was sort of just absorbing them. And we saw him quite often, visiting him and his partner in Bristol. So, like, it was. It's kind of strange him not being here, but I feel very thankful to have known him, because he feels like quite an extraordinary person. And having attended his funeral and hearing from many people that knew him in different situations outside of magic, he really did affect people very strongly. He made a very deep impression on a lot of people in a lot of different ways, but out of his character, which is something that translates into his magic as well. Extremely generous, absolutely, like a kind of purity, something like very honorable and clear about him, direct. And so there's been a lot of, I've been thinking quite a lot about him since he passed, and just how much he has actually given us as people, as well as the magical aspect of the work.
I think I've been sitting with his generosity as well, and his absence consequently, because something Peter wrote when we were going backwards and forwards about topic areas is he gave freely to those with genuine questions. And you think about, and this is good and bad when it came to Jake's time management, shall we say. He may have spent too much time on social media, but consequently, he would always have time for genuine questions and genuine seekers. And I think what you were saying about him from a personality perspective, that we understand that from a magical context, but it was plain
Mm.
that was in him as a person, and people who knew him outside of magic. Given a reputation, I mean, it's quite the title, right? England's preeminent necromancer. You expect that person to
Mm.
be meaner, but he wasn't. He was actually a very
Mm.
generous man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, unstintingly generous, and that's something that is thrown even more starkly into light when you see the fact that the way that the magical scene has grown with the internet, and the way that people have attempted to monetize every aspect of their magical identities and turn it into cash. That's something that Jake never did. So even when there was the big craze for everyone being a sorcerer for hire, and if you weren't a jobbing magician, then somehow you weren't authentic enough. And Jake rejected all of that, because the work that he did when he did magical work for the community, he did for people,
People
and
he knew.
he did it without charge, and he did it without fuss. And that was his attitude with everything. I mean, he didn't hide everything behind a paywall. He was there and available to deal honestly with people who were asking questions to him.
I mean,
Yeah,
there are economic imperatives to the situation now, but I think Jake had an obsession, and his obsession were the spirits, particularly the spirits of the Verum. So the work was coming out of that as well. It was a response to the relationship that he had cultivated with the spirits over like 40 plus years. And I
yeah.
think that kind of sense of responsibility, both to the spirits and to people, was some like essential part of his character that like didn't change, didn't waver.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that a little bit later, because I agree completely. And consequently, the particularly the Encyclopedia Goetica, the the underlying premise of that emerges from spirits and spirit contact in a way that wasn't history as officially practiced by historians, and that can only come out that way. But before we get to it, I think this is the right sort of time to discuss that, where Peter, you wrote Jake's legacy shows what an autodidact can accomplish, which I think is very true. And I had that written as he would not cede theorizing to the academics. Like he read academic work and devoured it, and but he was the one who was responding to it. He uh,
Yeah,
this people kind of don't understand that was at the time quite electrifying to just throw your hat in the academic ring. It's like, do you have any credentials? Like, not any of the ones you guys recognize. But Jake would engage with ideas at the level of an equal with academic work. So he respected it, but he did not he didn't bow before it in a way that made it canonical. And he
yeah,
was probably the first to do that in a way that had impact, and it's subtly different, and I want to talk to you guys about it because it's your books in which that is most evident. Well, Jake's books published by you guys. uh,
Yeah.
if you look at the terrible books of the 20th century, there's a difference between ahistorical magical books and books written by magicians engaging with history and academia, and
mm.
that is the Jake shift. I think. What do you guys think?
Yeah. I mean, Jake was also. I mean, when you read Jake's books, for the people who haven't perhaps opened up Geosophia or Testament of Cyprian, the level of scholarship in them is staggering. I mean, Jake's done a phenomenal amount of work, and also he's done the work that he was doing. He was doing off books and paper sources. He wasn't just like, hacking together Wikipedia articles
No,
and
it was deep
producing, you know
research.
material for for immediate dissemination. He was doing really serious research and engaging with the most hardcore academic texts that are out there. And certainly Jake was always keen on directing people to bibliographies. And I think it's important for people who come and approach Jake to understand that Jake is also a place that you begin and you branch out from. That's what he wants his readers to do. He wants his readers to go, well, I'm not following you all the way here, but I can see where you've pointed, and I can see the sources that you're pointing to, and I can then go on my own journey. And there was that sense of not being prescriptive in the way that he approached work as well.
I think he would. It's interesting how he responded to the academic writing, because he spoke about how it was Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon that made him realize that his understood history of witchcraft and magic in the West was wrong. And it evaporated. And so rather than rejecting what Ronald was putting in front of him, it made him question further, go deeper, ask more questions. And that eventually led to Geosophia and this quest for, well, where does our tradition come from? And I think that's also where the idea of a living tradition in relation to the academy is interesting, because it was Jake going through the academic sources and tracing it back to the archaic Gois, the tradition, that made him realize that if you plug the practice into this like substratum magical that we've inherited, then maybe the blood will start flowing again through the Western practice without necessarily having to have the sort of Margaret Murray illusion, or the idea that there was once sort of a great matriarchy, or these kind of ideas that have been disabused now. But I think so part of Jake's genius and brilliance was this ability to utilize the academic material, but turn it always towards a practical end. See it as part of how it could feed the magical tradition rather than destroy it.
And also to use a philemic metaphor, because theme was also very important in Jake's, particularly early in his magical career. Jake's very much like the Stele of Revealing. He's the magician who is standing eye to eye with the god, and he does that in the way that he approaches academia as well. He doesn't pander to the academic, and I see some magicians who write texts which are clearly like signaling to the academy, and I don't think there's any problem with magicians having high academic standards, but sometimes I feel that they're writing and directing their work at an academic audience more than at a practitioner audience by the way that they present themselves. And Jake never did that. And as a result, I don't think that the academy has yet caught up with the impact that Jake has had upon the history of Western magic, because he hasn't framed it in a way that they've been able to bring it within their discourse.
I think that's all of that is really quite observant. I like the Stele of Revealing metaphor, because funnily enough, how I characterize, particularly with Geosophia, Jake's contribution, and he and I had long conversations about this, to oversimplify to make it useful, there is the official history of Western magic when it comes to grimoires, which is Alexandria, Constantinople, Byzantium, Italy, Central Europe, England, obviously shooting out to Spain and the Nordics as well. And the core components, and this is obviously Dr. Skinner's PhD, the core components of what we would call Solomonic ritual, and it's excellent and it's correct from a historical perspective, we find in an Egyptian context, and literally circles and timing and so on, in the same way we get astrology from that. Jake had, with Geosophia in particular, an awareness, coming back to what Alkistis said about this work comes from engagement with spirits, a deep understanding of the Greek underpinnings of culture, European culture. And it's one of those things, because I would say to Jake, like, broadly simplifying a conversation that went over the course of a number of years, let's just take Dr. Skinner's PhD. It's like, this is historically correct. And he's like, sure. However, what I'm talking about in the Encyclopedia Goetica, he basically said, even if it wasn't true speech marks, like made true by historians, it's still useful. It's still a living, spirit alive contact method. And when you understand, and this is something that actually I would describe as a failure in his writings only because they're a couple of decades old, I would say today we have more of a language, let's call it post-archetypal, about how beings and spirits and ideas move and change in culture. And if you look at the Greek underpinnings of culture, where we do get these ideas of spirits and demons and monsters from, inarguably, he's right on this level of spirit-aware synchromysticism, or a word that doesn't exist yet. It's true at the level of being real and workable. And I think that was, for me, a really exciting tension in his work, which is, this is the best we could do is say this is a history of spirits, but like that's not quite right. But there's something when you read Geosophia, and it comes back to what you said, Peter, about I don't know who he was writing for, but Jake's books, particularly the Encyclopedia Goetica, are an invitation to fall down a Greek literal labyrinth into the guts and underpinnings of not just magic, but quote unquote our culture that births magic. It's dactyls, it's sibyls, it's all of this stuff that is there in the building of how we do and understand magic. And that is an achievement that you can't really put words around. Well, I'm about to get you to put words around it, but what do you think to my attempt to frame that?
Yeah, I think the fact that Jake was so generous meant that he really did. He created a book which any sane publisher would have never taken on, because his thesis requires a reader to really engage with material that is far beyond their reach initially. I mean, I don't know how many people in our broken culture have read Homer.
Stories.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people have read the Argonautica, but my hope is that the magicians will have picked up the true grimoire and gone, okay, I get this. This is a practical work of magic. This guy's really clear. Let's see where this goes. And then they pick up Geosophia and they go, oh my God, I've never been here before. I didn't know that archaic Greece existed. And then the challenge for them is to go back into our shared cultural history and contact that sub-Platonic layer that Jake feels the spirits emerge from. I mean, he feels that moment of emergence back there. That's where he's locating it, rather than being lost in the emphasis on the Judeo-Christian. His soul for Christianity is to say, no. Stop thinking about the grimoires in terms of the Christian opposition. Let's get back to the real roots of where the spirits come from and where they're encountered, and let's
magic.
Let's dig that trench and fill it with blood and watch the spirits of the dead come flocking towards it. Let's go back to those real archaic moments of magic and mystery, and I think that's an incredible invitation for people.
Yeah, it's funny you describe it that way. I'm having a memory, which I probably should have put in the blog post about Jake. But as everyone listening to this knows, I'm obsessed with Pirates of the Caribbean. And I was trying to explain to Jake that the novel that those things are based on by Tim Powers, which is called On Stranger Times, is the most novel I've ever read. And the intro literally opens on a Caribbean island where they are performing archaic Greek magic. They dig a hole and they put blood and offerings in, and they call up the spirits to curse someone. And in the typical Jake way, he's like, yeah, I'll read it. And I knew he wouldn't. So I literally bought him a copy of the book and sent it to him via Amazon. This is when he was still in the West Country. And obviously, because he's very polite and nice, the book showed up and he's like, oh, thanks for this. And he just sat down to read it. And I was at work, and 25 minutes later, 30 minutes later, he messages going, holy shit, this is really good. And I'm like, it is. It is a Jake introduction. Because one of the things I remember talking to him about with Testament of Cyprian was, he said Cyprian stands astride the old world and the new. And that was at the point where I'm like, that's it, Jake, I have to buy you this book, because it is a comic novel of high camp pirate drama. And Jake had an interest in, let's say, camp flair. that is literally Greek magic in the Caribbean. It's like
Yeah.
channeling him. But I want to come back to what you said about that archaic Greek layer, because I've been sitting with Jake's influence on my own work. And I'm going to get to that from a practical basis later. But the reason Starships is called A Prehistory of the Spirits is the long conversations Jake and I would have, where if you can, at least magically, if not textually, which is impossible for archaic Greece anyway, connect contemporary spirit list based magic to that archaic Greek level, because archaic Greece, the Greeks in general never met somebody else's idea they didn't like. And when you get to that archaic Greek level, you kick the door, and I pulled this book off the bookshelf. I don't like it, but you understand what I mean. If you get something like A Story Waiting to Pierce You, sorry, that's
Yeah. Yeah. No.
because I don't like Peter Kingsley's writing. I find it very patronizing. But this
Yeah.
book is the thesis, which is correct. It's alongside Jake's, which is when you get to that earliest Greek layer, you were looking at, and these are all problematic terms, I don't give a fuck, the arrival of Neolithic shamanism from something called Eurasia into a Greek level. So with Jake's work, when you can get, if you can put list-based magic in dialogue or living connection with archaic Greece, it kicks the door open to tens of millennia of spirit contact. And that, again, is one of the things I don't think why I want to do this show is so that people can understand that's one of the things that he did. That's quite impressive.
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, it's a phenomenally ambitious project, and unique. I mean, there are other people doing good work in the grimoires. I mean, Jake would always acknowledge,
all of them.
Joseph Peterson's work, Stephen Skinner and David Rankin's work,
Aaron
Leach's Secrets of the Magical Grimoires,
and
but
Jake acknowledged everybody, and he was so enthusiastic about anybody showing like application and interest in the grimoires. So, but yeah, he was very much trying to bring everybody into his argo and like moving.
You're right. That's a lovely way of saying it, because that generosity, there was also an awareness of, there was a humility regarding his own contributions, but also an awareness that, to paraphrase Jeff Bezos, it was day one of the grimoire revival. So, and that's true. I mean, I have, as many people know who listen to this, like a longer term view of, in particular, the premium membership, which is the work we do now is for kids in 100 years' time to be able to have lineages in magic and so on that we didn't necessarily have coming up through it. And Jake had a long view like that as well, which was this where at a really fruitful phase, and you're allowed on the Argo if it is a spirit first method of engaging with the material, which was his not necessarily line in the sand because of the generosity, but that was his thing, right? And in particular, how we approach the spirits, because we have, and Peter, you said this as we were lining the material up. He insisted on ongoing spirit discourse rather than hit up and ghost, which is the grimoire model as written, if maybe not necessarily practiced as such when we get back to early modern period. We don't know, there's been stuff you guys have published which suggests otherwise, but in theory, if you just approach the grimoire cold, it is a drive-through window. And Jake insisted correctly that was not the best way to approach the material or the spirits.
I think there's also I think one of the personality types that you find with magicians is also people who like to collect or to follow procedure. And so when they find a spirit catalog, then their kind of collectors, slightly autistic kind of thinking leads them to want to like work through every single one of the spirits and collect the set. Which, and Jake, I mean, one of the advantages of Grimorian Verum is that it's quite a small group of spirits. It's compact. So when you have a small group of spirits and when you have very limited base information on them in the grimoire, the only thing you can do is spirit contact and go deeper so that they flesh out and become the personalities and the characters that speak to you and inhabit your world, and you have this discourse with.
There's also, if you're moving from it's all in the mind model of what spirits are to their something you can't explain, but they're definitely not pieces of your mind, then you need to develop a discourse with them in order to like fathom what precisely is going on here, and what or who they are, and what exactly is the nature of our interaction. Where is it going? And yeah, I think that this is also a shift from like leaving behind Crowley's goetic sort of speculations and moving into an evidence-based, like, oh, I'm having experiences with spirits which can't be explained in these ways.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that a lot of Jake's spirit conversations were facilitated with the use of fairly simple technology, like use of the pendulum. When you'd expect kind of like more kind of like dramatic spirit incursions, and like, you know, kind of wilder tales. But when you look at what Jake's doing, it's very simple folk magic based, kind of low key methods which are available to almost, you know, which are available to anyone really with a bit of sense. So it's kind of nice to realize that everything that he achieves with very simple methods.
Very stripped back.
Yeah, because one of the things, if you look at his life, his interest was, which he would freely admit, his interest was never in making money, and not just with magic, just in life, right? So he was much more interested in, how do I say this, fleshly experience. But he was always very pragmatic about money. Like, if I need it, I can always make it, and that's always been the case. But consequently, there's how to say this, a folk humility or humbleness to his practice, which again, I think about in that context is we have the assumption that the more ornate and dare I say expensive a Solomonic ritual is, the better. And in some cases that might actually be true. But then you think about the magicians who had the most impact on history, and I think of, say, Dee and Kelly. That was a very simple method. That was basically two guys in a room with a little crystal. That was it. You know, so the idea that you need to have your robe and your lion skin belt, you know, is not always true. And Jake, I think, is a living embodiment of that, and consequently can be an inspiration for people finding their way into spirit engagement.
Yeah, and also, you know, as you say, like Jake didn't care for money. Like money was not like central to any of the decisions that Jake took with any of his life. And part of that was because he had a little bit of a chip, because he was coming from a, you know, self-taught working class background. You know, fuck the Tories. You know, smash the state. You know, which is great. But also he was opposed to those things because he saw like aristocratic angel magic as being simply about the manuscript, simply about the things, simply about collecting, and not about the actual process of doing magic. But the sort of paradox for me is that Jake made himself an aristocrat too, in that he had all the time in the world in which to practice magic, because he chose poverty.
Yeah.
And so he made himself free of those responsibilities, and was able to do the extensive magical work that you can only do if you're very poor or very rich. And so there's an interesting kind of like
I love that. Yeah, I love that. That's amazing. He did choose freedom, but I think obviously other people would. It's funny we mentioned the Stele of Revealing, various long shadows of Crowley, and one that's particularly inexplicable is why it is when he was high on heroin and stealing from fucking mothers to make this dog shit version of the Lesser Key, why it was that these random takes and like bitchy little comments at the front of it had a century-long impact on the practice of magic is inexplicable. Like, because Crowley himself didn't even believe that when he was sober. It's just garbage, right? But I think about Jake and Crowley, right? So Crowley would say, his gods are the gods of Egypt. And so when you actually look at the long shadow of Egypt, which is there in grimoire practice, Crowley cast two shadows over manuscript work or grimoire work. One of them was this fucking high on heroin, stealing someone else's intellectual property, bewildering rant, which is his piece of shit, lesser key. But the other one is the emphasis on Egyptian magic over Greek, and in a funny way, that overemphasis is balanced out by Jake's overemphasis is mean, but you know what I mean, on Greek magic. So there's a balance or a corrective twice to Crowley's impact on magic, but also on grimoires, which is, I'm glad it came from someone like Jake, because as you mentioned, I mean, half the time he would identify as a Thelemite. He would do Liber Resh daily and so on. That was because he grew up in English magic. And that at the time certainly was a cornerstone of it. Like even silly things like English Kabbalah, he absolutely loved, because of course he did, because that was his milieu and his colleagues.
And it was one in the eye to the Caliphate OTO, because Jake, of course, was a heretic and a member of a rival Thelemic group, and they cracked the code.
Yeah,
they cracked the code in Liber Leges.
Yeah.
So it's which I'm sure Jake loves. But it was a complex relationship with Thelema, and I think all of us in England have a slightly different Thelema to the American version of it, because we've got a different magical history. But many of us have gone through Thelema because that was the cutting edge technology at the time. And what Jake did, which was interesting, is that not only did he do the full syllabus of the Thelemic material, he then encountered chaos magic when chaos magic was coming up, hated it, but did the entire syllabus. Like, he went through all of the work to see if there was any value in it.
It's funny you mentioned that. One of the thoughts I had was something, I think it must have been when TCM, Testament of Cyprian, came out. Pete Carroll wrote something. It was either to me or on the blog. I can't remember. So hopefully it's on the blog and I'm not telling tales out of school. But he definitely did say this publicly, which was he would grumble in that Pete Carroll way about the return of necromancy to Western magic, because he said one of the defining characteristics of, let's say, Western magic was the absence of necromancy. And that's true, but he viewed that as a good thing. That's what I replied to him. Like, you're correct historically that we've just had 100 or so years off necromancy, but it's just you think that's good and Jake thinks that's bad. And that Jake and chaos magic tension, I always found very delightful. I still find very delightful. But that brings me to one of the things that, if you weren't there for it, which we were, that I don't think people realize, is how central Jake was to the return of the dead and the return of a European magical understanding and version of ancestors to practice now. And there is no one, like, going back to the officially correct opinions on magic you're supposed to have on the internet, there is no one anywhere who sleeps on ancestral practice anymore. And maybe Pete Carroll, but other than that, no one. And that's Jake. Not alone, but Jake was central to the return of the dead to magic. And it's one of the things I want people listening to this show to always know about him, and to, now that he is a magical ancestor, to be grateful for. Yeah. Which brings me, I suppose, to... Actually, I want to do this. You mentioned the angels and aristocratic magic, and it never occurred to me that Jake made himself an aristocrat, but that's just perfect, because when I remember when we'd hang out together, particularly when he'd get dressed up in that very Jake way to do events in Glastonbury or whatever, there was this kind of dimension shifting dandy approach to it, which was spectacular and just very much him. Sometimes cape, sometimes cane, hat with feather, jaunty angle. You get Jake in the books, and then you get Jake in person,
Yeah.
and you can work together. But you have to know both, because if you picture Jake from the books, you're like, what kind of terrifying Nosferatu-looking towered is this guy? And then you see him,
Yeah.
toddling down the fucking Glastonbury High Road, as dandy as
Yeah.
you like. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to, that we all had this incredible experience and this moment when that took place. And it's really to remind people that magical practitioners are very rare and they're not around forever. And if
Yeah.
you have the opportunity to encounter a Jake Stratton-Kent or a Gordon White, then do go and have a drink with them. Do go and see them when they speak. Do buy their books while they're still fucking alive, because this is a very, very brief moment that we have here, and you don't get the full magic unless you have those full encounters. And they are available. It is possible to do that, to see these people, to hunt these people out. I mean, finding the others, has been your project for some time, and like that can't stay online. That has to be something that occurs in the world as well. And for those of us who are lucky to have been friends with Jake and to have hung out with Jake, then please people have these experiences while you're alive, because that's what life's about.
That's lovely. And also to share the stories, which is what I want to do here and elsewhere, if you did get to meet them, because Jake knew, Jake met Kenneth Grant. It was the same thing. It's like talking to elders in the community who have overlaps where you kind of can jump back to times when others were around, and Jake is one of them, and I think it falls to us, one of the things we're doing here, but not just us. Elizabeth wrote some lovely stuff after Jake died as well, so friends who knew him sharing reminiscences, I think, is important for that to continue. And it's funny you mentioned us, which is lovely, in the same sentence, because it just brought a memory up. I think it was was he at the TCM launch? He was. I was at a. Did you guys do a book launch for Jake that he wasn't at? Have I?
No. We did a book launch for Jake that we didn't make it to, and the book didn't make it to either. I think we got paperbacks. There was it was a winter thing. We had snow and we had like water, frozen pipes bursting, and we just couldn't get there.
I remember signing one of his books. It must have been the TCM launch at Atlantis, because I remember talking to him about it afterwards, because either he wasn't about, but someone had bought his books and wanted them signed, and then they're like, can you sign it? All right, get a picture of this. I signed his book and sent that to Jake. That was fun. That was silly.
Okay,
he appreciated that. Yeah. Anyway, if you've got that one, maybe it's worth something. But Peter, you said something that I want to touch on, which is really important to unlocking Jake's legacy. And as I was skimming through TCM before recording this morning, that famous Jake line, I don't do angels. By the time Testament of Cyprian came out, he essentially had to qualify and explain what he meant by that, which is he doesn't do the aristocratic version of angels. And it's funny, like when I remember Jake, and even telling that story about Pete Carroll, it's not that long ago, but there was a time when you could have fruitful and electrifying disagreements with people without calling them Nazi or something. And so one of my departures with Jake, he kind of acknowledges this in TCM, which is to some extent that's been taken out of context. When he says, I don't do angels, what he means is he doesn't do what he would call aristocratic magic, although, as you say, he turned into an aristocrat. But I would always say to him, the angels are, I can make the case that the angels are older than the demons and your list spirits, but even if they aren't, they are co-equal in age. And to some extent, because of that position, I would say it's not a hole in his work necessarily, because he always acknowledged that the list spirits were his central concern.
Yeah.
But consequently, I don't think he's as strong on angels as he was with the list spirits. I
Yeah.
think there's a lot in angels that passed him by because of this position. I don't do angels.
Yeah. I think it may even go back to his initial contact with the Grimorium Verum when he was, initially being inspired by magic. He wanted to talk to the demons,
Yeah.
because he was
That's what drew him.
he was
That's what
anti-Christian. He was like
Yeah.
he was looking for something that wasn't going through the angels. He wanted to hear
The other
what the
side.
other side had to say. That was where he was looking. And I think there are limitations in that, brilliant but throwaway kind of like phrase, I don't do angels, which sums up a lot of Jake's character.
Yeah.
But also I think it helped him narrow the scope of his work, because we all
With his
all have,
intellect as well, he would have been having even more things to go into, but he was
Yeah.
able to just focus on the.
Yeah, we have to narrow the aperture somehow. And I
Absolutely.
think I don't do angels is also a way of him not having to go down that direction as well.
But on the level of eros, there are things you are drawn to, and Jake was just drawn to the chthonic,
Yes.
the demonic, and
Yeah.
that was, he. I think it was his intuition that drew him to the Grimorium Verum, and then he discovered more and more reasons why it was such a perfect manual of magic for him, and why it became a living manual in his hands through his editing and kind of recreation of it from the fragmented pieces. So I think this is it's one of those intuitions he just drew
Absolutely.
into.
So that takes me to, because I agree, and I angelology is infinitely expanding. Like if we did have to do angels, you have to get into that really on the spectrum, Trithemius code breaking, and for people who like that, it's brilliant. But if people start asking precise and detailed questions about angelology to the peri-homeless grimoire guy, yeah, it's not, this isn't the right person. And so I get, I don't do angels, which brings me, speaking of Verum, the other thing that I want people to know about Jake's legacy is how little regarded the blue grimoires were before Jake. And his love of them led to some ahistorical takes that were at least in service of getting people to try to take these documents seriously, or at least more seriously. So again, that was one of the points of departure between me and Jake, where he can't use true history, as in official history documents, blah blah blah, to make the claims that he made for the blue grimoires, and arguably didn't need to. I think just focusing on the blue grimoires and taking them seriously is something that is so important from a legacy perspective, because it's in the blue grimoire overlap that we get the next part of Jake's impact, which is patchier, but still essential, because he was essentially the first to do it, and the people who do the thing first, it's never a perfect implementation, but everyone who comes afterwards requires it, which is when you situate yourself in the blue grimoires and take them with a bit of respect. That's the beginning of a old world, new world dialogue, because of the impact of the blue grimoires in new world magic. This is the overlap, the mangrove swamp, where Jake can situate and have a really powerful and fruitful conversation. But I was sort of watching the conversation immediately after he died, and I just wanted to center that, along with the Return of the Dead, and along with the, how do I say, the pervasiveness that is little understood of archaic Greek or archaic Greece in magic, regardless of documents. 1, 2, the third one is getting the world of magic to take blue grimoires seriously. What do you think?
I think he found something in the blue grimoires which was integrating again the celestial and the chthonic, or the magic you find as well in the magical papyri. And he saw that evoked in the Blue Grimoires too. So you have both the low folk magic, and you have aspects of timing and relationship to the heavens as well as to the earth and the materia magica. And so I think he felt in the Blue Grimoires an entire world that you also feel in the Greek magical papyri, but obviously, in Europe. So related to our flora and fauna and our woods and so on. I think that, so the Blue Grimoires gave him that way of bypassing. This is also like something that I think where he went beyond Thelema again, where Thelema doesn't hold this possibility and the Blue Grimoires did, that they have this connection, the similarity to the magical papyri, and that there's not enough of that influence because the Crowley and the Golden Dawn didn't have access to the same materials, but Jake's generation did, and he could see in the Blue Grimoires the resonances and the similarities and this use of materia and timings and so on. So,
And
as well as the spirit contact aspect.
Yeah, and these things have been excised. I mean, people who've come to magic like recently won't realize how limited the sources are that we were all working from. I mean, we were working from an extremely small corpus of available texts. People were doing some quite remarkable things with it, but there was a strong impact from the psychological model, as you say, from Crowley's essay, The Initiated Interpretation of Ceremonial Magic, whatever it was, at the start of the Goetia. And from chaos magic as well, which was for the most part running a psychological flat model. So the idea of the importance, the tactility of materia magica, was completely absent in these magical spaces and needed to be returned. Even the entire idea of that there's no spell work in Thelema that's effective.
Yeah.
There is, there's obviously some results magic in chaos magic, but it's not quite the same as what the Blue Grimoires were doing, which was saying that these are things that what are the down and dirty things that people need from magic and need to do in their lives.
These herbs, this day, this dirt, that day, hand of glory, actual materia. Yeah.
And that timing aspect was absent as well from magic. Magic had thrown
but Jake
all
had been
the timing
interested
out.
in that from the 70s. Jake and his magical groups had been working with astrology for a long time, and I think that's another thing, that he always had an astrological element to his practice and to his magical understandings, and that's come much more to the fore in the last 10 or 15 years. But Jake was really interested in that from a long time back and had been incorporating it into his workings and experiments. So I think,
but also,
you go.
Also, it's important to see that although Jake was including those elements, as a practical magician, he was using them in a very simple fashion. I mean, for practical magic, you don't need top end astrology.
you can go by planetary hours.
My feeling is that you leave that to specific astrologers, but as jobbing magicians, Jake's very much, there's a simple way to calculate this. These are simple tools. These are simple timings.
Different registers as well. He could work from a much more sophisticated astrological register, or just down to lucky and unlucky days, planetary hours, and so on.
So Testament of Cyprian is the final of the Encyclopedia Goetica trilogy for people listening. And it's half astrology, but not just that. It's really sophisticated. Like, bitch, where are you hiding this? And you do, coming back to what you were saying, Peter, that he would use, let's call it, for want of a less annoying term, folk magic timings, which I would say is day and hour as being the most important. But that's not because he didn't know the other stuff. He could tangle with that. If you wanted an election, he could get you one. But I agree completely that Jake's work suggests very strongly that when it does come to magical timing for the kind of stuff we find in Blue Grimoires, Hour of Mars on Tuesday, adequate.
Yeah.
And
there's no time to lose.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You need to do something for a client quickly. You need to get something quickly. Then you can't afford to wait for those long elections.
No, and that, because it is a different part of the Western lineage, or that kind of precise Arabic timing with more of that Neoplatonic philosophy and so on, which he was squeamish about. Although I would have this conversation with him, and I think I think it's in Geosophia where he describes like low Platonism, which is a term he invented, as the cosmology he's talking about. And initially that irked me, but as the years have gone on, I'm like, no, actually, I get what you mean now, which is that it's where the rubber meets the road, practical, active version of, broadly speaking, the cosmology of the Hellenistic world, which can get very precise, very educated, very aristocratic angel. But, and this is one of the things that he intuited correctly, and subsequent actual historical information has kind of borne out, that at a lived commoner level, there was something which I don't think academics would call low Platonism, but that's what Jake meant, that the ever presence of the chthonic, of spirits in their Greek culture, which we inherited and were kind of birthed out of. And it's funny, like here's where failing is the wrong word, because he was the first person to do this, because I want to move into his impact on at least my work. When you get to Blue Grimoires and you see the return of the tactile and timing and materia, and Jake correctly saw that it at least rhymed with what we see in the Greek magical papyri, because of that next step of trying to connect them historically, I think is, one, unnecessary, but two, kind of like the weaker part of that thesis, where he'd get obsessed with the difference between daggers and swords and decide that if asafoetida was used in the 18th century, it's an indication that it's a continuity of 2,500 years or whatever. That with no other evidence. And the trouble is, when you try to play the official history game, that's where he left himself open to criticism on the level of official history. And ultimately it's unnecessary, because if you step into the world of magic and spirits being real, you don't need to make the historical connection through textual documents and the European obsession with the same, because if it works, it works. And you can do other stuff instead to look at it. And this is where it comes to things that he did first, and consequently it didn't quite land, but it was never going to, because he was first, which is the profound interest and here's an impact of Jake on my work, on the use of comparison to understand and breathe, or bring the blood back, as you would say, Alkistis, to European magic. Because it's not just going back, looking at that 1,500-year gap between the Verum and the Greek magical papyri and going, look, like some of the ingredients are the same, let alone the actual thinking behind it, which is true. But going horizontally around the world and looking at other, and in particular South America, Central and South America, which was his interest from a comparison perspective, and looking at how other, dare I say, less destroyed by, or at least more slowly destroyed by the Enlightenment traditions, he could see like they're doing the same thing. And so Jake, it didn't land in a lot of cases for a couple of reasons. It was like the first dialogues between, let's say, South America and European magic on the level of practitioner. So it didn't, some of those earlier claims haven't been borne out, but that's not the point. The point is the beginning of that dialogue and comparison, and that understanding of the resonance of some kind of true magic on a planetary basis. And for me, that's been very important in how I do magic and how I teach it. And it was Jake who held the door open for all of us to begin that kind of comparative work. At least that's how I see it. What do you think?
Yeah, I see your comparative work as very much in the line of what Jake was doing. And I hope that people recognize that you've made that contribution and that you're making that contribution. Although it may not be immediately apparent to someone how, a book like Animistic is in the same lineage as a Geosophia. They're doing the same thing, but it's two magicians who are at slightly different slightly different points in the timeline and have come from slightly different cultures, but are still trying to deal with the same issue. I mean, Jake was dealing with gaps. Jake was dealing with a broken tradition. We've all been looking at what we had in the West and going, how do we fill these gaps?
Yeah.
Can we fill these gaps by going back into our history? Can we fill these gaps by reaching out to other practitioners in the rest of the world who are using techniques which we think we can also utilize, in a sensitive way to fill the gaps in what we're doing. And Jake tried to begin that discourse because the blue grimoires had washed up in Brazil. They washed up all over Central and South America, and those traditions in the New World, like when they were looking at, when you look at Kimbanda, they looked at Verum and they went, "Oh, okay, well we'll take these seals and we'll put them in our own little spell books and we'll associate them with Eshu's." And
Yeah.
and
Something new is born.
I think it's been rather unfortunate that that Jake's received criticism for this because on one level, people are saying, well, it's okay for people in South America to take material from the blue grimoires and then add it to their spirit tradition. But it's not okay for the people who use the blue grimoires to then start to try and engage with that spirit tradition as well. And I think Jake received some undue criticism even before we've entered the new age of, cultural appropriation and all of this nonsense that people are talking about, when magic is and always has been a syncretic tradition. We're thieves, we're magpies, we take stuff and we make it our own through use. And that's how culture works.
Jake is not coming from the position or the place of an imperialist anyway. He's coming from the position of low magic.
Yeah.
And someone whose genuine intellectual curiosity is what drives all of these. Like, his heart is very open and his intellectual curiosity is very open and voracious. And so it's not coming from a bad place at all. It's coming from trying to make contact place. And so I think he was misunderstood over that because he got caught up in, the larger discourses going on in the world, these different currents about what is right for Westerners to do.
And to his credit, I agree completely. One, it's hard to be the first person to do something. You're just never going to be. It's almost thankless. You're never going to get it right. But if you don't do it, no one else can. That's part of it. But also, Jake, as the years went on, he would be the first to admit, like, okay, maybe that was the wrong way to say that. And I certainly don't mean it in like an extractive or appropriative way. He was to the very end interested in and was perfectly prepared to criticize and revise his own understanding because it was ambitious. He had to be first. No one had done that before. And to your point about magpies, Jake would love this, right? And now we can talk about it this way because we are downstream from his effort, which is when you look at the incorporation of the Verum, Red Dragon, whatever, into Brazilian and some Caribbean magic. That is exactly what happened with the Greek magical papyri and its incorporation of Hebrew names and angels and so on into it. It's like, well, this shit works. I'll have that. Thank you very much. Yeah. And so it kind of, even in, I don't want to say, failure is too strong a word, even in those clumsy first attempts, it nevertheless proved the thesis, which is there is a thing called magic that is some kind of universal, and one of the things it does is dialogue and learning and shifting and spirits and techniques move between them, because again, at the level that Jake was operating at, which is a horizontal one with other practitioners around the planet, let alone in our own culture, that is in his head, that is a sharing between equals, which it is. Now, the language that comes up above it subsequently about, imperial power relations and post-colonial discourse, that's all valid and true. And there's a lot of medicine to be had by sitting with it. But it is to some extent a different thing to what Jake is doing, because let me tell you, where they don't talk post-colonial discourse is in a Brazilian spiritist context. That's not like, does this stuff
Yeah.
work? Is more the case. And so I agree. There was he had to, and was always willing to make those changes and have those challenging dialogues. But he was essentially the first to
Yeah.
begin, or to attempt to begin, a process of comparison among some kind of equals, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of the problem is also that we need another 100 years of Western magicians who are worthy of that
Yeah,
name to be able to have that conversation properly. No,
couldn't agree
we're
more.
still
We're at the
we're
start of
still we're
something.
still at the start of something.
Yeah, which again he would acknowledge, and he knew
Yeah,
to be the case. So
absolutely.
yeah, I think so. That again, from a almost epistemological basis, there is, and I'm glad you noticed it, but then you published both our books. There's a lot of that in my um, couple of years of lengthy daily discussions with Jake about all kinds of stuff. And I look about my practice and see more of Jake. So the centrality of St. Cyprian, I definitely got from Jake, unsurprisingly, having written that
Mm.
book. And that remains. So St. Cyprian is, I guess you would say, an unofficial patron saint of mine, and that's because of Jake. And that's Jake, prior to the book coming out, commending Cyprian to me and suggesting in which directions it goes. And uh, he was interested in Cyprian as a container being, and which is why he said he stands astride the New World and the Old, but he also stands astride the Mediterranean. So Jake, this Cyprian as metaphor was really transformative for Jake to understand how to begin that process of putting all the things we just discussed in dialogue, which
Yeah.
I found intellectually interesting. And then engaging with Cyprian as a being, going, well, there's also another way of coming in that, which is there's a reason he's a container being, because he is just that episode with Martin Shaw, I'm unfortunately going to use the word archetypal. He is the archetype of the European sorcerer, and it is a magpie. It is a polyglot magpie being, and that, so it's enfolded in on itself, and it's why Cyprian's, and thanks to Jake, been there at the center of my practice, and the Cyprian craze, whatever it was about 10 years ago, a bit less.
Mm.
That's all down to Jake.
Yeah.
He would,
Yeah. Completely.
starting things. But like
He's one.
practice wise, that was one of them. And the other one that I think about, and again, I hope magical history understands this, coming back to his singular focus or central focus being the list spirits, the return of the four kings to their rightful position. Jake played a very big part in that. And so consequently, because we would have long discussions about the headless right, because he wrote that pamphlet decades ago, and that plus my discussions and experience with the four kings led to the, how to describe this without sounding annoying. Unfortunately, there's no way. The combination of the headless right and four kings that people can find in the chaos protocols, there as a ritual resonance with the process of creating the book of the law. Jake held my hand through every step of the way of that. And even to the point, because one of the reasons it's, to get technical for people who haven't read it yet, Araton rather than Egin is in there. Although I do say Araton called Egin, I ran past Jake because Araton is the name of the king in the process that led. So that was the name that was used for Crowley to contact his HGA, and consequently, as a result, Book of the Law, which is where the headless right comes in. And I ran that logic past Jake, and he's like, yeah, keep it as Araton. So when I think about my practice, and I really only did this morning in preparation for the call. I mean, not really, but like actually listing where I find Jake in my own work. Those two are pretty big, and that none of that would be there if it wasn't for him. I don't know. What has he influenced how you guys do stuff?
Well, he was really the first book that Alkistis cut her teeth on in terms of.
Having an idea what I was doing. I don't know. I had my experience, like, because my work is so different from Jake's, and I haven't really worked with grimoires for several years now. The influence is really just that proximity to his text when I'm formatting the books and spending that time, in his mind, like finding I guess the clarity of his thought, the expansiveness, the sort of the directions, the incorporation of so rich material. It's quite staggering, but I mean that appeals to me. My mind works in a much more disorganized way than Jake's, but it has been very inspiring. Um, Not directly influencing my practice, maybe more closer to Peter's work than mine.
Yeah, Jake for me is Jake's like kind of a useful foil for me because my practice is kind of diametrically opposed to a lot of Jake's positions. Like I don't care for the Cyprian material at all. I'm not a fan of Grimorium Verum personally.
Me neither.
Um,
Yeah.
um, I'm much more interested in the dealing with the problems of Christian theology that Jake skips over in order to go to the subplatonic roots. So,
Yeah.
uh, so I take from Jake um, that that common feeling that we all have as magicians when you work and you have that archaic contact, and you
Yeah.
have that sense of the deep age of the spirits that you're engaged with. And I think that's probably the best thing I take from Jake because my work is all with um, destroying and unpacking the Christian material that's in the middle, because I don't think anyone has seriously solved the theological problems that the grimoires
Yeah.
Hold.
hold, which is which is the work I'm doing with Praxis. So Jake also saved me a lot of time because I spent a lot of time working on a grimoire text, and then Jake produced Pandemonium, which unfortunately is a mess, but it did save me from having to continue doing that work because that was scribbled all over essentially that part of the field. So there was no point in producing a similar work in that vein. So Jake saved me some time there. But I like Jake's generosity of spirit a lot, and I like his strong practical approach. And I think the lesson that everyone should really take from Jake is rather than asking a stupid question to a supposed authority on a Facebook group or wherever, do the practical work.
Just do it.
Just do the practical work, and you'll find the solutions yourself. And also, don't be don't be so don't be overwhelmed with the sheer volume of information that we have in front of us now. It really isn't helpful. If you see Jake as having any value, then you have to understand that he began with very, very simple texts in very broken states, and he went deep into those. And I think there's a real strength
Gold there.
to be found in doing that, to narrowing one's focus as well as broadening one's focus and reading. Go read Homer. If you haven't read Homer, please read Homer. Read the Argonautica. Do these things that Jake's pointed to. Pick up. Make sure that you have a copy of the PGM. And that you're aware of the way that spells and magic go together. Yeah. And just remember the old sod.
Yeah.
I think Jake is the first ancestor of the modern grimoire revival, and I think it's important that we all continue to honour his name and his work, and that will happen. I mean, one thing that we've been doing with overseeing Jake's death is his copyrights are all going to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. So when we produce more Jake works, we'll probably end up.
I hope we can do the other Encyclopedia Goetic
We'll probably,
volumes.
yeah.
We were speaking to Jake before he went into hospital about doing Geo and Testament following the True Grimoire reissue. So
because Geo in particular
we can do that.
Geo was a very short, cursed run. We had a nightmare with that book. So the number of copies of those that are in the world are extremely low. And any of the royalties and money that comes from that goes to the Museum of Witchcraft, and that's where Jake's effects will be as well. So they'll be there for future generations to see. So,
that's
the
good.
work continues.
That's really good, because the Museum of Witchcraft has been waiting for an ancestor like that, and now it has one. So that's well done. He'll like that, I think. And he did like the West Country. He'll be more of a neighbor now with his stuff there. This has been good. What else? This is a really nice way to end it. Is there anything else? Any other reminiscence or something you guys would like people to know about Jake?
I don't have a bad thing to say about him. That's it's rare to know someone and not have like a little niggle about them. But Jake was
a sweet
Jake was Jake was a star. Jake was his own man, and he lived his life as he wished to, and he produced phenomenal work with extremely limited resources due to the fact that he chose to do that. He dedicated himself to the work. He did his magical retirements. He did all the thankless work without an audience, and that's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable thing.
Yeah. I would just say yes. That's absolutely all true, and so I'm grateful to have known him in life, and I am grateful for all that work that you just said. I hope people. This is why I want to do this show. I hope people. I'm sure it will happen. I'm sure it is in the process of happening, but he is that first ancestor of the revival, and we need to, if we are still a community, have that understanding that that's what he is and that's what he did. And he did it as this amazing and singularly unique person. He was more thelemic than Crowley in most ways, right? Like he actually lived the implications of that. It's like, I am going to live 100% my life, and he did. Yeah,
and just thinking about it, I mean, the one thing that Jake tried to do and never managed to do was to write a magical primer. He was always kind of like worrying about whether he could produce like Paul Huston's Mastering Witchcraft. And I think he missed the fact that it was right in front of him, and it is the True Grimoire. I mean, the True Grimoire is the text that I would say that a young magician or a starting magician could go to and get their feet wet and begin to understand what the practice of magic really is.
Yeah, lovely. Well, well, guys, thank you very much for this. This was exactly the conversation I wanted to have, that I've been thinking about, and thank you for your assistance, which is invaluable in getting Jake's work out into the world, because there's the person that changes the culture, and there's the people that make that happen, which is you guys, and we are grateful to you for doing that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Great conversation. Lovely to see you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Have a good one.